I'm 27 and my younger sister, Sophie, is 23. Growing up, we had a classic older sister-younger sister dynamic, but it wasn't always smooth. My parents, especially my mom, have always had high expectations for us, but they treated Sophie differently, almost like she was more fragile. I never minded too much when we were kids. It felt normal, like that's just how it was. But as we got older, it became clearer. Sophie was the favorite child. We're a close-knit family, weekly dinners, text group chats, all that. But being close doesn't always mean smooth sailing. My parents are the kind who think they're always right. They don't really listen, not when it's about things they're set on. It's not out of a lack of love, they just think they know what's best, especially for Sophie. And with Sophie, they have a vision, a career path, a lifestyle, everything laid out for her. It's been that way ever since she graduated from college. She wanted to explore her options, take some time to figure out what she wanted. But my parents? They wanted her to settle into a steady job, preferably one that they could brag about to friends and family. Recently, Sophie's been struggling more than ever. It's like she's caught between wanting to follow her own path and not wanting to let our parents down. Every time we chat, she sounds more stressed, her voice tight over the phone. She's always been the type to avoid confrontation, to keep things calm, and I think that's part of the reason she's their favorite. She doesn't push back, at least not to their faces. But behind the scenes, with me, she's different. She vents, she cries, and she admits that she's feeling suffocated by their expectations. A few weeks ago, she came over to my apartment. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept properly in days. We sat on the couch, and she started talking about how she felt like she was losing control over her life, how our parents just wouldn't get off her back about her lack of direction. I thought she was just looking to vent like usual, but then she dropped the bomb. She asked me to be the bad cop in all of this. Her idea was that if I spoke up, if I was the one to bring up her struggles to our parents, maybe they'd take it seriously. She figured that if it came from me, it wouldn't sound like whining, it'd sound more like a serious concern. I could see where she was coming from. She thought our parents might actually listen if they believed I was worried about her. But it also felt like she was asking me to take a bullet for her, to be the one to go up against our parents while she stayed in the background. I didn't answer her right away. I just sat there, trying to process what she was asking me to do. It wasn't like I didn't want to help her, she's my sister. But I knew how our parents could be. They would take it as me siding against them, turning my back on everything they've done for us. I remembered a few years back when I tried to speak up for her about something way less serious. It didn't go well. My mom had barely spoken to me for weeks, and my dad just kept saying how disappointed he was. Still, seeing Sophie sitting there, looking so defeated, made it hard to say no. She wasn't asking this lightly. She genuinely seemed desperate. She kept saying, I just can't handle it anymore, but I don't know how to make them understand. And honestly, I could see how much this whole situation had worn her down. After what felt like an eternity of silence, I agreed. I told her I'd try to talk to our parents, to bring it up in a way that might help them understand what she was going through. A few days later, I invited our parents over for dinner at my place. They came in, cheerful as usual, probably expecting another casual night of family bonding. But as soon as we sat down to eat, I knew I had to get straight to the point. I started off light, mentioning how I'd noticed Sophie seemed a bit stressed lately. I tried to frame it like it was just a casual observation. But the moment I brought up how she felt about their pressure on her career, the mood shifted. My mom's smile tightened, and my dad just looked puzzled, like he couldn't believe I was bringing this up. Things escalated quickly. My mom accused me of blowing things out of proportion, saying that Sophie was just going through a phase and that I shouldn't meddle. My dad, who's usually more level-headed, seemed hurt, like he couldn't understand why I'd take Sophie's side over theirs. They both insisted that they were just trying to guide her, to keep her from making mistakes she'd regret. But the way they saw it, my stepping in felt like an attack, like I was undermining their authority. I tried to explain that it wasn't about sides, that I was just worried about Sophie, but they weren't having any of it. Meanwhile, Sophie, who I'd hoped would step in at some point to back me up, just sat there, barely saying a word. She looked down at her plate, fiddling with her fork, but she didn't say anything. It was like she'd left me to deal with the fallout on my own. After my parents left, the silence in my apartment was deafening. Sophie finally spoke up, but instead of thanking me, she looked uncertain, almost accusing. She asked if I thought I might have gone too far, if maybe I'd misinterpreted what she wanted me to say. I didn't know how to respond. I felt like I'd done exactly what she asked, but now she seemed uncomfortable with how it had all played out. It was clear that the gap between all of us had only widened. My parents were upset with me, Sophie was feeling unsure about the whole thing, and I was left standing in the middle, wondering if I'd just made everything worse. I tried to explain to Sophie that I was only trying to help, but she didn't seem convinced, and suddenly I felt more alone in my own family than I ever had before. Update 1. The morning after the dinner with my parents, I woke up to a string of missed calls and texts from my mom. It was clear she was furious. I didn't call back right away, hoping things might cool down, but by noon she showed up unannounced at my apartment. My dad wasn't far behind. They didn't waste any time, they dove straight into it, accusing me of causing unnecessary drama, stirring up tension that didn't need to exist. My mom kept saying that I'd crossed a line, that I'd made things harder for Sophie instead of helping her. I tried to explain that I just wanted to support Sophie, that she'd been struggling and needed someone to help her speak up. But they dismissed my words, saying I was overstepping. They painted Sophie as someone who just needed a push, not someone who needed rescuing. It was like they believed I was trying to sabotage their relationship with her, which made no sense to me. But every time I tried to get a word in, they just got louder, insisting that I had no right to interfere in family matters. Sophie was there, sitting on the couch. She didn't say much, just stared down at her hands while our parents went off on me. I kept looking to her, hoping she'd back me up, or at least say something, but she stayed quiet. Her silence felt like a betrayal, like I was the only one taking the heat for something we'd both agreed on. After my parents left, they didn't slam the door, but it felt like they might as well have. After that, I knew I had to put some boundaries in place. for my own sanity if nothing else. I decided that I wouldn't get in the middle of things like this again, not unless it was really necessary. If Sophie needed my help, I'd be there, but I wouldn't let myself be dragged into the crossfire without good reason. It was the only way to keep things from blowing up like this again. That night, I shared a vague post on social media, something about feeling misunderstood and being caught in a tough spot. It wasn't meant to call anyone out, just a way to let off some steam, but of course people started reading into it. I got messages from friends and family asking if everything was okay. A few even sent me their thoughts on the situation, which quickly turned into unsolicited advice. Some said I should just apologize to my parents to keep the peace. Others thought I was right to defend Sophie and that my parents needed to hear the truth. It felt like I'd opened a can of worms without even meaning to, and now everyone had an opinion. A few days later, my mom called. I thought maybe it'd be a chance to clear the air, but it wasn't. She started in on how I should know better than to share family issues online, even if I hadn't named anyone. She kept going, saying that I needed to stay in my lane and let them handle Sophie's future. It was like she'd forgotten all those times they'd relied on me to help mediate family disagreements before. Now suddenly I was the problem for trying to help. The conversation ended as tensely as it had begun, with my dad taking the phone to back her up, repeating that they expected me to leave these things to them from now on. Meanwhile, Sophie started pulling away. She wasn't as responsive to my texts, and when I asked if she wanted to grab coffee, she brushed me off, saying she needed time to think. I couldn't help but feel like she was distancing herself on purpose, like she regretted ever asking me to get involved. It was a weird shift. One week we were talking almost every day, and the next I barely heard from her. The silence made me question if I'd done the right thing. Feeling like I was spinning out, I reached out to my best friend, Leah. She's been my go-to for years, always giving me a reality check when I need it. We met up and I spilled everything. Sophie's request, the dinner, the blow-up with my parents. Leah listened, then asked a question I hadn't considered. Do you think you're enabling Sophie by always stepping in for her? It caught me off guard. Leah pointed out that maybe Sophie needed to learn how to stand up for herself without relying on me to do it for her. It was a perspective I hadn't thought about, and it stuck with me. I tried to reconnect with Sophie again, dropping by her place to see if we could talk things out. She answered the door but didn't invite me in. She looked tired, like she'd been carrying the weight of everything just as much as I had. I asked if we could talk, but she said she needed space, that she just couldn't deal with everything right now. Her words stung, but I tried not to let it show. I told her I'd give her the space she needed and left, feeling like I was losing my sister one day at a time. A week later, there was a family gathering at my aunt's place. I went, hoping maybe things would settle down, but it ended up being another mess. My parents were there and they didn't hold back in letting my aunt and a few cousins know that I'd been overstepping. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. I caught snippets of conversation, like how I should have stayed out of it or how I was making things harder for everyone. It felt like I was being painted as the bad guy in a story where I thought I'd been trying to help. By the end of the night, I realized I couldn't keep letting this fester. I decided I'd set up a family meeting, a chance for all of us, me, Sophie, and our parents, to sit down and actually talk. It wasn't like me to take charge like this, but I figured if I didn't, no one would. I just hoped that this time, we'd finally manage to get on the same page. Update 2. I managed to set up a family meeting for the following weekend at my place. It took a lot of convincing to get everyone on board, especially Sophie. When I first brought it up, she didn't look thrilled about the idea. She worried that things might blow up even more, that the conversation would end in a shouting match. But I insisted that it was time we all sat down and tried to clear the air. She eventually agreed, though she looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. When Saturday came, the tension was thick from the start. My parents arrived first, sitting down stiffly on the couch, arms crossed. Sophie came in a few minutes later, hesitating at the door before finally joining us in the living room. No one seemed to know how to start, so I took a deep breath and dove in. I began by talking about how much I cared about our family, how I wanted us to be close like we used to be. I said I felt like things had gotten out of hand, and that I didn't want anyone feeling like they weren't being heard. My mom's expression barely softened, and my dad just gave a tight nod. I could feel Sophie's eyes on me, but she stayed silent, still not sure how things were going to go. Then, like clockwork, my mom started talking about how I'd stirred up trouble by bringing up Sophie's issues. She said that all I'd done was add fuel to the fire, and that things were fine before I got involved. My dad backed her up, adding that they thought I should focus on my own life instead of trying to fix theirs. The defensiveness was palpable, and I could tell they thought I was the one who had caused this whole mess. I tried to keep my tone steady as I explained that I never meant to undermine them. I told them that I was worried about Sophie, and that she had come to me for help. I just wanted to be there for her. But it felt like talking to a brick wall. They kept turning my words into accusations, like I was blaming them for everything. Out of nowhere, Sophie finally spoke up. Her voice wavered, but she kept going. She admitted that she'd been feeling stuck, that she couldn't keep up with what our parents wanted for her life. She told them that the pressure was too much, and that she felt like she couldn't breathe sometimes. For a moment, the room went quiet, like no one knew what to say. That's when I brought up the real reason we were there, that night when Sophie had asked me to talk to them on her behalf. My parents looked surprised, like they hadn't considered that she might have wanted my help in the first place. Sophie nodded, backing me up, and said that she didn't know how else to make them listen. It was emotional, but it felt like for the first time in a while we were all being honest. As we talked, something unexpected happened. My parents, especially my dad, started opening up too. They admitted that they were scared for Sophie, that they worried about her not having a stable career path like I did. My mom even confessed that she didn't know how to relate to Sophie's struggles, that it reminded her too much of her own uncertainties when she was young. I could tell it wasn't easy for them to admit those fears, but it gave me a new perspective on where they were coming from. But the honesty also led to some blow-ups. My mom got teary-eyed, insisting that they'd only ever wanted the best for us, and my dad's voice rose as he talked about how hard he'd worked to give us opportunities. Sophie snapped back, saying that their good intentions felt like control, not love. It wasn't pretty, voices were raised, and at one point Sophie almost walked out, but I managed to convince her to stay. Somehow, after all the yelling and the raw emotions, we started talking about boundaries. I told them that Sophie needed space to make her own choices, even if it meant making mistakes. My dad shifted uncomfortably but eventually nodded. My mom looked like she wanted to argue, but instead she just sighed, her shoulders dropping as if she'd finally realized she couldn't keep pushing the way she had been. By the end of the meeting, we reached a sort of tentative compromise. My parents agreed to give Sophie more room to figure things out without constant pressure about her career choices. They also acknowledged that I wasn't trying to turn Sophie against them. It wasn't perfect, and I could see the uncertainty in their faces, but it was a start. Before they left, my mom pulled me aside and, in a voice barely above a whisper, thanked me for trying to mediate, even if she didn't agree with how I'd handled it at first. It wasn't exactly the heartfelt apology I'd been hoping for, but it felt like a step in the right direction. My dad gave me a quick, awkward hug which caught me off guard, but I appreciated it. After they left, Sophie lingered behind. She looked more relaxed than she had in weeks, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She thanked me for pushing through with the meeting, for sticking up for her even when things got tough. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a quiet acknowledgement between sisters, but it meant a lot. It felt like we were finally on the same side again. As I closed the door behind her, I realized I actually felt hopeful for the first time in a while. The meeting wasn't perfect, and I knew there'd be more bumps in the road, but it felt like we turned a corner. Maybe, just maybe, we'd find a way to be a family without tearing each other apart. Update 3. After the family meeting, I thought we might be heading toward a calmer phase, but it didn't take long for things to get messy again. Word of our little intervention spread fast among our extended family, and not everyone liked what they heard. My aunt, my dad's sister, was the first to call, hinting that I'd gone too far and suggesting I should just let my parents handle Sophie's choices. I tried to brush it off, but it kept coming up at every family gathering. Relatives would pull me aside, making comments like, you shouldn't interfere too much. It's their job to guide Sophie. The whispers spread, and soon enough, the narrative turned against me. It felt like every time I saw a relative, there was a new story about how I'd supposedly undermined my parents. Some even hinted that I was the reason Sophie seemed so lost lately. It stung more than I expected, and suddenly I found myself feeling like an outsider within my own family. One evening, just as I was starting to feel like everyone was against me, my cousin Leah, different from my best friend Leah, called me. We hadn't been close in years, but she'd heard the gossip. She told me about her own struggles with her parents, how they had tried to control her life until she moved out of state to get some distance. She mentioned how difficult it was to find balance and how easy it was for families to put all the pressure on the person who tries to mediate. It was a relief to hear her perspective, like maybe I wasn't the only one who'd gone through this. She even suggested family counseling, something I'd never really considered before. At first, the idea seemed over the top, but the more she talked about how much it helped her, the more I thought it might be worth a shot. Meanwhile, Sophie was pulling back again. At first, she'd seemed lighter after the meeting, but now she was avoiding my calls and ignoring my texts. I tried dropping by her apartment, but she barely spoke, giving short answers and insisting she was just busy. It felt like the more I reached out, the further she retreated. I started worrying that maybe all the tension had pushed her to a breaking point, but she wouldn't let me in long enough to find out what was really going on. At the same time, my parents kept pushing me from the other side. My mom called almost daily, suggesting I needed to snap Sophie out of it and get her back on track. My dad wasn't much better, saying that as the older sister, it was my responsibility to make sure Sophie didn't throw her future away. It was like they'd forgotten everything we talked about at the family meeting. Every conversation felt like a tug of war, with me stuck in the middle, trying to keep the peace without betraying Sophie's trust. With all the pressure mounting, I decided to take Leah's advice and see a therapist on my own. I figured if I couldn't get everyone on the same page, maybe I could at least find some clarity for myself. The therapist helped me see that the patterns in our family had been there long before this latest drama. She pointed out that I'd been playing the role of peacemaker for years, always stepping in to smooth things over. But she also taught me some conflict resolution techniques, like how to set boundaries without feeling like I was abandoning anyone. Around this time, Sophie hit her breaking point. Late one night, I got a frantic text from her asking if she could come over. She arrived looking exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. She admitted that she felt like she was spiraling, that the constant back and forth between wanting to please our parents and trying to find her own path was eating away at her. She broke down in a way I hadn't seen before, confessing that she didn't know how to deal with everyone's expectations anymore. We stayed up for hours, just talking. It felt like a turning point, like she finally trusted me enough to let me in. I listened as she vented about how lost she felt and how she wished she could just disappear from all the pressure. It made me realize how much of her struggles mirrored what I'd gone through when I first moved out, trying to find that balance between family loyalty and carving out her own life. After that night, I knew I needed to talk to my parents again, this time with a clearer head. I used what I'd learned in therapy, focusing on boundaries. I told them that Sophie needed space to make her own choices, even if they didn't always agree with them. My mom tried to argue, saying she was only doing what was best for Sophie, but I stood firm, reminding them that this wasn't about controlling her path but letting her figure it out on her own terms. Things came to a head at our next big family gathering. It was supposed to be a casual dinner, but tensions were high, and it didn't take long for the conversation to turn to Sophie's future again. My mom made a comment about how young people these days don't know what hard work looks like, and my dad followed up with a remark about how Sophie should be more like me. It was obvious they weren't over the fact that she wasn't following their plan. Before I could intervene, Sophie stood up, her face flushed with frustration. She told them that she was tired of being compared, tired of feeling like she wasn't enough just because her path looked different from mine. The room went silent. It was the first time she'd ever spoken up like that, and I could see the shock on my parents' faces. They tried to respond, but she held her ground, saying that if they couldn't accept her choices, then they didn't really care about her happiness. It was messy and emotional, but it felt like a breakthrough. For the first time, Sophie wasn't just letting things slide. She was standing up for herself, even if it meant clashing with our parents. And in that moment, I saw a glimpse of the sister I always knew she could be, strong, independent, and unafraid to speak her mind. When the dust settled, the tension in the room was palpable, but there was a strange sense of relief too. Like maybe after everything, we'd finally managed to start breaking out of our old patterns. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it felt like a step towards something better. And I couldn't help but hope that this time, we might actually be on the right track. Update 4. After Sophie's outburst at the family gathering, something shifted. My parents seemed shaken by her words, and though it wasn't an instant change, I noticed them trying to be more careful about how they approached her. Conversations that would have been tense before became slightly more open, like they were walking on eggshells but trying to do it for the right reasons this time. A week later, I brought up the idea of family counseling during one of our phone calls. I didn't expect much, just another polite dismissal. But to my surprise, they actually agreed to try it out. My mom hesitated at first, saying she wasn't sure if it would help, but my dad seemed more open to the idea, saying that maybe it could be a way for all of us to get on the same page. We booked our first session for the following weekend. The first session was awkward, to say the least. We sat in a small office with a therapist who seemed way too cheery for the tension in the room. My parents stayed mostly quiet, while Sophie fidgeted with her hands, avoiding eye contact. I felt like I had to do most of the talking, trying to explain why we were there without making anyone feel attacked. But as the hour went on, things began to shift. The therapist guided the conversation in a way that made my parents open up, talking about their worries for the future, their fears of losing connection with Sophie. My mom even admitted that she didn't know how to handle the changes in our family and that sometimes it felt like she was losing control. Sophie was quiet at first, but eventually she shared how much the pressure had been affecting her, how she felt like she could never meet their expectations. It was tough, but there were moments when my parents actually seemed to listen, like they were hearing her for the first time. By the end of the session, the air felt a little lighter. It wasn't a magical fix, but it felt like we'd taken a step forward. Over the next few weeks, we kept going to counseling sessions. They weren't easy. There were still plenty of tense moments, but we started to build new ways of communicating. The therapist encouraged us to have regular family check-ins where we could talk about any concerns without it turning into a full-blown argument. It was weird at first, but slowly we began to get the hang of it. Meanwhile, Sophie seemed to blossom in a way I hadn't seen before. She started making more decisions for herself, signing up for a new course she was interested in, and even taking on a part-time job that she'd chosen for herself, not because it fit our parents' vision of success. I could see her confidence growing, and I tried to support her whenever I could, sending her encouraging texts, showing up for her when she needed advice without pushing my own opinions on her. It wasn't just Sophie who was changing. My parents, who had always been so rigid about what they thought was best, began to ease up. They stopped bringing up their usual comments about Sophie's career path at every dinner, and I even caught my dad asking her about her new job with genuine interest. My mom, too, seemed to soften. One evening, after a counseling session, she pulled Sophie aside to apologize for pushing too hard. It was the first time I'd seen her admit she might have been wrong. The change wasn't overnight, but it felt like we were finally starting to heal old wounds. During one of our sessions, my mom opened up about how her own parents had been strict with her, how she'd always promised herself she wouldn't make the same mistakes but ended up doing so anyway. My dad talked about his fears of us drifting apart as we grew older, something I'd never realized he worried about. These weren't easy conversations, but they made me see them as more than just stubborn parents. They were people who had their own fears and regrets. Sophie, too, seemed to be healing. With the weight of constant expectations lifted, her mood brightened. She laughed more, made plans with friends again, and even started considering some bigger goals that she'd always put off. Her mental health seemed to improve, and she'd drop by my place just to hang out like we used to before all the drama started. It was like she was finally finding her way out of the shadow she'd been living under. Word of our family's progress spread through our extended family, and surprisingly, some of them began to come around. My aunt, who'd been so critical before, actually called to say she was glad things were getting better. Other relatives who had taken sides during the drama started showing more support, and even the gossip died down. It felt like everyone was realizing that sometimes, families just have to work through things in their own way. My cousin Leah, the one who'd suggested counseling in the first place, became a regular part of our family dinners. She shared stories about her own experiences, reminding us that we weren't the only ones struggling to navigate family dynamics. Her presence helped lighten the mood, making our gatherings feel less tense and more about building new memories together. With time, we even started creating new traditions. Instead of the old weekly dinners that used to be so stressful, we planned game nights and outings that were less about checking boxes and more about enjoying each other's company. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when my parents would slip back into old habits, but those moments didn't feel as permanent as they used to. As for me, I found myself reflecting a lot on how much had changed. I realized that learning to set boundaries didn't mean shutting people out. It meant figuring out how to keep myself from getting lost in the chaos. It wasn't easy, but it felt like I was growing into a stronger version of myself, one who could support Sophie while still looking out for my own well-being. Looking back on everything, I can finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's not like all our problems disappeared overnight, but there's a sense of hope that wasn't there before. And as I watched Sophie finding her way, I couldn't help but feel proud of how far we'd all come. For the first time in a long time, it felt like maybe, just maybe, we were all going to be okay. Update 5. A few months after our last counseling session, my parents organized a big family reunion at their house. It was the first time in years that they'd invited everyone over, and they wanted to celebrate some of the positive changes we'd all been working on. It felt like a chance to test out our new dynamic in a bigger setting, with all the relatives who had watched the drama unfold from the sidelines. I was nervous, but also curious to see how things would play out. Sophie arrived at the reunion looking more confident than I'd ever seen her. She walked in with a relaxed smile, chatting easily with cousins and catching up with relatives she hadn't seen in months. It was like a complete shift from the Sophie who used to hang back at these gatherings, trying to avoid too many probing questions about her life. Now, she proudly talked about the part-time job she'd taken on, the courses she was interested in, and some of the plans she had for the future. A few of our aunts and uncles even seemed surprised by how much she'd grown, throwing her compliments that she accepted with grace. The evening was filled with laughter and stories, and for once, it wasn't all about what was going wrong. We shared stories about the good times, about growing up, and even joked about some of the awkward moments from our family's recent struggles. My parents looked more relaxed too, like they'd finally learned how to let go a little. My mom pulled me aside at one point and thanked me for pushing for the counseling sessions. It caught me off guard, especially coming from her, but she said that she realized how much it had helped them understand Sophie better. My dad joined us and echoed her thoughts, adding that he was proud of how I'd helped keep our family together. It was the first time they'd ever said anything like that out loud, especially in front of the rest of the family. For so long, I'd been the one caught in the middle, feeling like I was pulling us apart more than bringing us together. Hearing them acknowledge my efforts like that, it felt like a small but significant win. My cousin Leah, the one who had supported me through the whole ordeal, stood up after dinner with a glass in hand. She'd become a regular at our family gatherings, and this time she decided to give a little speech. She talked about how important it is to support each other through tough times, how every family goes through challenges but comes out stronger when they work through them together. She mentioned how proud she was to see us all making progress, and how the changes she'd seen in Sophie and me gave her hope for her own family. It was emotional. There wasn't a dry eye in the room by the time she finished. As the evening went on, I found myself thinking about how much things had changed. I watched Sophie mingling with relatives, my parents chatting more openly with everyone, and I felt a sense of relief that had been missing for so long. It was clear that we'd all grown in different ways. I realized that standing up for myself and for Sophie wasn't just about the hard conversations. It was about showing up for each other when it mattered, even when it wasn't easy. At one point, Sophie pulled me aside, her face lighting up as she shared her latest plans. She wanted to move into her own apartment soon, find a new job that aligned more with her interests, and maybe even look into a degree she'd been considering for a while. She seemed genuinely excited, and when she mentioned it to our parents, they actually encouraged her. My mom even offered to help her look for places, while my dad talked about helping her with the moving process. It felt like a complete 180 from the days when any mention of Sophie doing her own thing would have led to an argument. As the night wound down, I found a quiet corner to take it all in. I thought about the journey we'd been on, how messy, frustrating, and sometimes heartbreaking it had been, but I also saw how far we'd come. My parents had learned to listen. Sophie had found her voice, and I had learned how to set boundaries without feeling guilty about it. It wasn't the picture-perfect resolution I might have hoped for, but it was real, and it was ours. We talked a lot that night about what we'd learned in therapy, about how understanding each other's perspectives had helped us get to this point. The therapist's insights about communication and empathy had made a huge difference, even beyond the sessions. We started sharing the little things we appreciated about each other, stuff that had been buried under all the tension for so long. It felt like a new chapter. We focused on making new memories, things that weren't defined by the conflict that had consumed us for so long. My parents even suggested a few new traditions, like taking turns hosting small family dinners without the pressure of having everything be perfect. It was a simple change, but it made a world of difference in how we connected. I know that future challenges will come up. Every family has its ups and downs, but for the first time, I feel like we have the tools to handle them. We've learned how to talk to each other without it turning into a battle, how to support each other's choices without feeling like it's a competition. Before we all left that night, I hugged Sophie and thanked her for trusting me, for letting me help even when things got tough. She squeezed back and just smiled, a genuine, warm smile that I hadn't seen in a long time. As I drove home, I couldn't help but feel like everything we'd been through had led to this moment. We'd fought, we'd struggled, but in the end, we found a way to come back together. And for the first time in a long time, I felt optimistic about where we were headed. Love and understanding had pulled us through the hardest moments, and I believed that it could keep us going, no matter what came next.